Welcome, everybody, to the inaugural session of the Microsoft Data Platform Business Continuity Virtual Group. This session was recorded on June 23rd, 2021. This session focuses on open questions and answers with this virtual chapter. That's a good point. Don't need to trace
Are
that.
you using a single network or are you using double networks so that you have a dedicated heartbeat?
Single.
That's another thing you might consider is
Yes
isolating
and
that heartbeat traffic. Because I've
yes
seen
and
the
no.
main path flooded before, and it does something similar.
The problem is it doesn't really buy you redundancy in that sense. And if the Windows Server failover cluster is up, but the AG is still down, like like in virtualized environments, I generally don't recommend more than one VNIC unless you know it's going down separate physical paths and stuff. And definitely up in AWS and Azure, you're not getting that.
Yeah.
Sure.
You're right, but you're right, Ed. From a troubleshooting perspective, if you throw in the additional VNIC, but then you got to worry about subnets and setting up all that stuff in AWS, which is a huge pain in the rump of just setting up the networking to do that.
Yeah. I'm going to double check on the networking bandwidth because that's something I haven't checked in there yet.
My guess is it sounds like you're choking, and then it gets to a point where no other because if you're not losing the actual nodes themselves, like they're not going down,
Yeah,
but it's just losing networking connectivity. I would actually also probably check the cluster log and see if it's complaining about the nodes can't talk to each other.
that I did check, and I haven't seen that.
Okay.
That one specifically. Now, this one's just been weird.
Yeah. I mean, they're never going to really tell you unless you open a support ticket, but like I said, it could also be something Amazon's doing on the back end if it's random.
It's been a little of both. We did double check with Amazon, and they claim everything is fine. But
yeah,
I've heard
Microsoft
that
claimed everything was fine until we saw this repeatedly to customer, and they escalated. And they're like, "Oh yeah, we were doing maintenance. Sorry, you guys are sensitive. Change these thresholds. Have a nice day."
They also always come back to you should be using RDS instead of EC2. No matter how many times you explain to them why you won't use RDS.
Third-party vendor requirements. You know how that goes. Well, cool. So yeah, I'd say let's just open the floor. Arun and Chris, welcome. I don't know if you guys want to turn on your cameras and say hi. Edwin, same with you. You can see my profile photo doesn't quite match my appearance right now.
It's all good.
COVID haircuts.
COVID lack of haircuts. I just figure, when else in my adult career will I ever get a legitimate excuse to let it go again? So another 3 or 4 months, I'll be able to pull it back. That's all I want.
I know, I'm actually kind of wondering if I'm going to be traveling again. I know it will be. Like, it can't drop to 0, but yeah, I'm definitely not on the 2 or 3 trips a month rotation I used to be.
At some point, I'll get back on the road, but I don't think I'm ever going to get back onto the road to the extent that I did before. That was tiring.
That's kind of where I'm at. Is this year was a reset. I'll probably do some, but I don't need to like travel 1 billion miles a year.
Yeah. The good thing about the pandemic is it's shown that we can do what we do remotely. Maybe a little bit slower because of people's availability, but it still gets done.
And then be more confidence in other travel too.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a better balance. I mean, I can think back to like customers where you just had to be there and we're all connecting to Azure stuff, and it was just kind of a big waste of time to do all that and go there, and they're paying for it and all that. I think a lot of that's going to back off, but yeah, I mean, there is still a need, and I know we're seeing it a bit. Like, my company is participating in actually like an in-person conference this week for what we do, and attendance and sponsorship were actually up over the 2019 version. So there are people that want to get out and do all that. But yeah, there's going to be a better balance. Some of this you just have to be here, and that's how it is. I feel like we've likely put that to bed over the last 16 months. But yeah, I mean, there are some times where it's just better to be in a room with a whiteboard, but not every time.
Yeah, I think conferences are definitely coming back. There's no substitute for in-person networking.
Yeah.
Even if the content you can pick up online, that's
Well, being able to say, hey, you asked a really good question. Let's go get lunch and talk through it. You know, that you just don't get online.
Yeah.
Cool. Do we have any questions? Anybody on? Otherwise, we could sit here and talk for hours. Yes, so far I don't see any. And I know we're just launching this, so getting the word out has been a little hit and miss. I think a lot of people are not online right now because it is gorgeous outside. But we'll get this going here.
Yeah, there was a non-zero chance I was going to do this from my back deck because it's like 75 and perfect here.
Nice.
Same here.
And I think it's 95 and warm outside here, so I'll stay inside.
we are having our first cloudy 60-degree day for like a couple weeks now, and I'm actually loving it. It was too warm for a while.
I don't know. For me, it's in the high 60s and really, really nice where I am right now.
Mm-hmm. That's my kind of weather right there.
Mm-hmm. Alan, are you
So
in the Boston area or are you off someplace else?
No, I'm still here.
Okay. It's like the weather should be about the same for you.
I have no idea what it's like outside, to be honest with you. I'll find out later when I go to rehearsal.
At this point, if I walked outside, I'd probably burst into flames. So.
No, it's just been one of those days. I've been pretty heads down, actually. So
That's cool.
So I'll throw something out since we've got a lot of smart folks here. We've got a server that is perpetually doing weird stuff that support cannot figure out. Got
physical,
ADR.
virtual.
So it's Hyper-V.
Okay.
David knows
weird.
more of the backstory here. So we've got RCSI on, we've got ADR on, and the thing will occasionally stack dump and can't figure out why. And we'll occasionally have a transaction that is unkillable. So it's just a zombie. It'll sit there and it'll run for days or weeks. And eventually you restart it, it goes into crash recovery, everything comes back fine. Haven't had a lot of good luck with support because it's an odd set of issues. And we've got tempdb in memory and all that. So I feel pretty confident maybe that we've run into a bug. But I haven't gotten plugged in with somebody, I guess, that can kind of elevate that. So I'm curious because a lot of you work in environments, either similar to the one I'm in or much larger. Have you seen anything like this? Because it has happened on 2 of our servers, and they're the only 2 that have RCSI and ADR on, and in memory tempdb. Nothing else shows it.
Which SQL version are you on?
2019, and it's recently patched.
Okay.
And the patch did not correct this. It's like we patched it and it still did.
Have you been looking at like perfmon or like before this happens? Does like CPU go up or memory, or is anything different from a perfmon perspective that you could say when we start seeing this condition? It's like 2 hours after that this happens. Like it's about establishing that pattern.
I haven't been able to draw a line like that. What has been interesting is when you get these zombie transactions that, they run for days or they die for days. Like they don't die until you restart the service. There's artificial CPU spin there. Like when that happens.
That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, the baseline CPU goes up, but we can't. There's no way we have not figured out what in the world it's doing, because generally these are pretty simple things that seem to get hung up. Like it's an update of 5 rows or something, and
but is it the same query or the same update all the time, or is it different stuff?
Different stuff, but it's regular workload stuff. It's probably something that the thing executes 1 million times a day, and then every several weeks one just won't finish, but everything else will work. and it's a weird thing. So like, you schedule a service restart and it fixes it, but it's not comfortable. Like, it's not a way I like to run because it doesn't make sense.
I mean, it sounds like a bug to me, but it sounds like I said, if it like what generally when we deal with these issues, we look for patterns in perfmon, and then we look at if it was like a specific query or update or insert or whatever, like if that's the same. But since you're saying it's not, then you kind of have to rule that out as that's different. Because if you can find whatever common factor, like even if it's like an hour before, like I said, you see that CPU spike just a bump, like that's the moment that it probably hiccups, and then at some point there's your zombie. But since it happens randomly, it's like you need to be tracking that all the time and looking for literally needle in a haystack.
One thing
and
that
that's
I
basically what this is.
Oh, go ahead, man.
Well, I was just saying it's basically that. Like, we see the consequences because the CPU will go up once it goes zombie, basically, and we'll see that it's up above baseline, but in theory not doing anything. Like, it's something that should finish in half a second, and it just never does. But you can tell when it's happened because, not only like backups are tricky because it can't checkpoint the thing because the transaction won't finish. But it's just that CPU just goes higher to, doing whatever it's doing. Anyway, Ed, you were saying.
Yeah. Has in these incidents, does your tempDB size go up? And I know it's a little bit different because you said you're in memory.
Not really. No,
Okay.
There's nothing that sticks out that's like, oh, this happens every time it happens. It just basically we'll see a backup fail with a weird error, and you'll go look and be like, oh, well, that happened again.
The reason I asked
support's
is
not too interested in it. They just can't figure it out.
I ran into a situation at a client recently that was very, very odd. It involved RCSI. And it took me a while to trace it back, but what I eventually found by digging into the actual text and the actual locks that were being held is that they had multiple databases using RCSI on this server. And one of those databases on some process that we never were able to identify, opened a cursor and did not properly close it. And because that cursor was left open, and it looked like the cursor may have been disposed but not deallocated, that it left the cursor open. That caused that marker to be put into the road version store. And because they were using tempDB at the time, as part of this, it cascaded across all of the other databases that had RCSI enabled. And in our case, we had physical tempDBs and so the size of tempDB ballooned. In your case, you wouldn't have that because of the differences in the way that the in-memory architecture for tempDB works, but that might be something to check on. It was a very odd circumstance, and it's not documented anywhere. Not that I could find.
That's interesting. Yeah, because none of this would trace back immediately to anything that happens in a cursor, but our code base does have some cursor-based stuff in it. That would be an interesting kind of spelunking to do in SentryOne, to see if there are cursor related executions happening right around when one of these just goes, yep, I'm not finishing.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. That's
I was not able to capture this information via
SentryOne.
I wasn't able to capture this information via SentryOne. I actually had to look up the queries to be able to do this by hand when I was doing it, just because it was buried that deep. But
got it. Well, it's at least something, because I mean, not to drag support at all, but spinning wheels a bit.
Yeah.
Because we're just not getting plugged in with the right folks, and it is a weird collection of things. It's one of those things that could be 50 different things that's wrong. But it isn't, because we've sorted through most of those. They just don't believe me. So, okay, yeah, that'll be an interesting path to go down, because that might contribute to our issue.
Yeah.
So
the circumstances don't seem to match 100%, but it's like, okay, well, this is it might be another avenue to look at.
Well, I mean, right now it's basically at so.
Yeah.
If I can move beyond that, then it's something.
Cool. So welcome everybody that joined. Do any of you have any questions related to anything business continuity, HADR, backups, and restores? Anything strategy related, anything at all? So everything's working absolutely perfect all the time for all of you?
So I'll throw something else out.
Yeah.
Because it's something that somebody asked me, and I couldn't think of a great answer for it, but I know this group likely has thoughts on this. What is the threshold where you run, don't walk away Hyper-V?
Interesting.
You could honestly, yeah. So to me, just take Hyper-V and throw any platform there, because it's sort of the same argument, right? Because if you're already inclined to throw away a platform, be it like something more, say, physical, like a Nutanix, or a virtualization platform like ESXi or Hyper-V, you're already thinking that it has problems, or it's caused you problems, and it's unstable, and somebody's already made up their mind. It's just they're looking for some tangible evidence, like, see, that's what makes it not work. When sometimes it's bad hardware or bad configuration, which is more often than not. Because here's the thing about both, and I've used Hyper-V plenty, but most of my customers are ESXi. I have no bias towards either one of them. I know VMware would love me to say more positive things about VMware. Microsoft would love me to be super loving of Hyper-V. And I've been hypercritical of both. Reality from my perspective, I'd be curious, same thing, to hear other people's opinions, is that they both have virtually the same specs in terms of what VM sizes can be, host sizes can be. It boils down to your ecosystem and how you want to manage things. Because, whether you want to do S2D for hyperconverged or vSAN, it's all basically the same stuff. So at that point, you're just making a platform choice based on what you want. If they say Hyper-V sucks, I'm going to go put in, ESXi or Zen or whatever it is, they're going to get the same crap. I hate to say it. It's just a different flavor of the same crap. And if they implement the same crap in the same wrong way, it's going to be terrible.
Yeah, it's each one have their own quirks. And sometimes the individual quirks of the platform get to you. But at the end of the day, they both do just work. Now, Matt, I know privately where you're going with this, but I'm going to keep that out of my opinion here. To me, if I'm comparing the platforms, just how do you manage it? What telemetry can you get from it? How stable has it been for you? And have the instability, just like Alan said, been related to misconfigurations or quirks? Just like VMware, I love all the hypervisors, to be frank. The VMware's bugs lately have been driving me nuts. Hyper-V has been fairly solid. But that said, I've got a couple of other sites running Hyper-V, and they do have their own set of quirks. And one of them are thinking about going to VMware because of the quirks that they are encountering. There's quirks in all of these things. So I've got one that they're talking about going back to physical because they're tired of the quirks in all of them. So I tell them, great, you can have the quirks with the physical equipment now.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. I'd never looked at it as a threshold thing, but in my mind, it was always, Hyper-V is free, more or less. VMware is not. So in my mind, there was always some divide.
ESXi is free. vCenter and central management is not, just like Microsoft with SCVMM and all the other jazz. Sorry to interrupt you there.
That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
Well,
it
like,
too. Is
I
people
always
think
had
they're
that
going to either save.
artificial divide.
Well, but the thing is, people have biases. Technology biases. And once we all do to a degree, actually, that's just the way it is. Having said that, as a consultant, I can't really think that way because every one of my customers is very different in their needs,
Yeah.
desires, wants, economics, you name it, right? Like there's any number of factors that come in here. And you just have to, again, take a step back and look at the big picture of, is this a political issue? Is this an actual technical issue? Or is this just somebody who's just annoyed that day at the platform because something didn't go right? And all those things could be true at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've got one customer right now. They're upset with Hyper-V because the Hyper-V networking stack has been flaky. And the configuration is pretty straightforward. Nothing too fancy about it. They like the way that VMware's virtual networking works. It's different. They like the way that one works better. That's where they're going with it. I've got another one. They've done the VMware deployment on SD cards. The latest bug has taken out 2 of their sites where a number of people got to go home for the day without pay because of it, and they're pretty upset and looking at Hyper-V. So if you put all this together, they all have their quirks. They all do. And I spend a lot of my week working with all of these quirks. What's your experience been? It's like I have private biases towards certain pieces of equipment, certain technologies, but just like Alan said, at the end of the day, what do you need? What's your budget? How do you manage things? What skills do you have in-house for how to manage this stuff? What do all of those pieces come together to point you in the appropriate direction? It might not be what everybody thinks is the right direction, but what's the appropriate direction given everything that you've got in-house?
Yeah, and that's really the underrated part of this is, and I know I've got sessions where I talk about it, but a lot of times you pursue kind of the Cadillac high availability solution or DR whatever, and you're like, well, we bought this tool or we've got this thing and it's the coolest thing and it works great. But if you can't support it in-house, it's not great. It may be cool, it may be nice to talk about in a session or write a blog about, and here's what we've got, but if nobody understands how to support it, it's not nearly as good as you think.
Yep. But I'll put an asterisk next to that saying sometimes, for example, as a consultant, if those are the cards you're dealt with, you just have to work within the framework, and you can caveat the hell out of it. You could say, I don't think this is the right solution. I think you should do something else. And if a customer is hell bent on doing something, and I've seen this many customers over many years. This isn't like I'm thinking of any one specific customer of mine. It's going to get done that way, and then invariably, at some point down the road, could be a month, could be a year, could be 2 years, they go, you know what? That was a really dumb idea. And it's not I told you so. It's like, well, it is what it is. How do you want to fix this going forward?
Yep.
Because you can't I've been saying this a lot lately in different scenarios, but you can't relitigate the past. You can only move forward.
Oh, that's why you document.
Yeah.
So yeah, if your company or somebody you know is looking to throw out Hyper-V and they're just looking for a reason, it's already going to go. Like they're just looking for the final nail in the coffin.
Yeah, it wasn't us, but it was somebody who kind of came to me like, what do you think about this? And they were looking for kind of data that's like, oh, more than this, whatever, Hyper-V sucks.
No, that's not true at all.
No, not anymore.
Yeah,
right. It's an arms race with scale. And who's got machines that big anyway? Do you need 700 cores on a VM? I mean, it'd be great, it'd be fun, but you don't need that. So to me, it's how are you going to manage it? To me, the data is if you have Hyper-V and you have 10 admins in your shop that know VMware in and out, and you have half one that knows Hyper-V kind of, well, you might want to think about it or get some training.
Well, the only thing I will say about Hyper-V that is, again, good, bad, or different, because both of them have patching issues, as David pointed out, is drivers, to me, make much more of an effect in the Windows ecosystem than VMware. I'm not saying that drivers don't matter in the VMware ecosystem, but you're at the mercy of your NIC card drivers, your HBA card drivers. You get a bad NIC driver or bad HBA. There are historic problems with Hyper-V and clustering when you get bad NIC drivers, right? And I'm talking like months of pain until the vendor finally sorts it out, kind of stuff. So Windows, if you want to have a knock on Windows, it's you're only as good as the stuff underneath. And while that's true of VMware, it's very direct because the hypervisor pretty much literally is running on the OS. Whereas I look at, and maybe this is not quite right, but it's the way I sometimes explain it. ESXi is a purpose-built thing, whereas you basically have Windows with this feature you enable. It's a very different mindset in implementation.
Yep. I completely agree with that. That has been a quiet knock on Hyper-V. Not to say that you don't have VMware bugs on VMware, because you certainly do, but it is much less prevalent. And that's not to say that the Hyper-V layer is widely problematic like that. But when you hit it, you definitely hit it. With VMware, it is very rare for me to ever need to update a driver for a physical device to make it more something.
Yep. Do we have any other questions out there? So if not, I'll throw one out to everybody.
Go for it. Don't see anything yet.
All right. So I've seen an interesting trend, because it's sort of where I started, 20 plus years ago in this whole crazy mess. But I've seen a big trend to go back towards FCIs in a lot of my customers, physical and virtual, cloud or on premises. So I'm just curious if anybody else is seeing the same, because it's almost like an availability group's backlash in some cases.
I've seen it. I've seen people that have got quirks around file share witnesses and stability. I've seen people that don't want multiple copies of the data. I've seen people that want standard edition but don't want to deal with tons of different availability groups because they have a lot of databases they want to protect. I've definitely seen it, and there's some legitimate reasons for it.
Yeah,
sure.
I'm fighting through one right now where it's all about not wanting to synchronize agent jobs, not wanting agent jobs to be AG aware. A lot of frustrations with getting SSRS to fail correctly, because you aren't really supposed to run SSRS on a relational DB server, but everyone kind of does, and it's kind of painful.
Yeah.
Not that I endorse the approach, but I do kind of get it.
Well, SSRS is really problematic on FCIs. I mean, so that isn't solved in either scenario, actually.
Well, at least on an FCI, you don't have to go through and delete all the jobs and bounce the service if available.
Fair enough. But you have the issue with SSRS itself.
Yeah.
So you see, to me, that's more the problem than the other stuff, right? And that's sort of the hard part about this is the shared storage story is still pretty terrible across the board.
It is. Shared disks on Hyper-V are a whole lot better than they are on VMware. VMware 7.0 released it, but only on Fiber Channel, and a lot of caveats to it. And then you've got software solutions for it, none of which I'm thrilled with. Some of them do work well, but I'm not thrilled with any of it. And that's or pass-through disks, and that generates a lot of concern for a lot of system administrators out there.
Yep.
But is it worth dealing with that to get around some of the challenges with the other stuff?
And so what we were talking about earlier with VMware versus Hyper-V, everything is trade-offs. Everybody thinks that if I've got these requirements, it fits neatly in this box. And when you're designing solutions, take even HA out for a minute, everything winds up being compromised because something is not going to balance in the way that you want it to balance. Whether it be you design this thing, you find what is the perfect solution, and I use that very loosely, and then somebody goes and costs that out and goes, oh, we're not paying for that. So now you go, okay, what are you willing to give up? And of course the answer often is nothing. And it's like, well, come up with money or we figure out what goes.
Yep.
Because both of these things not in harmony, right? And it's just one of those things where people think that just as all of us on here have been doing this forever, and we drop in with these magic solutions that just work. It's not reality.
Yeah. No, what's funny is, so my perception is similar but a little bit different. Like, now that I'm not consulting, I'm not dropping in the customers all the time. But when I speak, when I speak on these kind of topics, I'm more the beginner route than I would say most of you. Like, I'm introducing people to it, or kind of telling them what I screwed up when I got started. And what the vibe I've gotten over the last few sessions I've done like this is there's this perception out there that availability groups are kind of unfinished. That, like, they're cool and they do good stuff, but maybe the GUI's not right, or it's not a beginner thing, and like FCIs are easier. And I'm not quite sure, like, when people will ask it during a session or after a session or over email or whatever, it's the same old thing. Like, well, what problem are you trying to solve? How long does it have to stay up? All this sort of thing. But the general vibe under all of this is like there is kind of this weird backlash that, like, a bunch of people have now decided that it's a cool feature that's not done, and so they don't want to do it. And I disagree, but it's out there, and I'm not sure why.
Alan, I think you have an opinion on this. I'll let you go.
I'm not going to say too much on that because I love Microsoft, but there are certain things I will say. For example, distributed AGs, wholly unfinished. And I've actually been complaining about that since SQL Server 2016. So we're going on 5. If we can go back to the CTPs and the private betas and stuff, we're like 6 years of complaining about it. All right. And so yes, Microsoft does have a history of, shall we say, misfit toys. But I would say as a whole, availability groups, the feature is complete. I would say the management experience is not optimal.
I think that's a fair statement. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
It is.
The distributed AG
But for a lot of
management
kind of
story is
beginning people,
awful.
or people that would be like,
Yeah, I don't know. I just think Microsoft, there comes a point for them where it's good enough, right? Good. I'd say VMware does the same thing. So this is not an indictment of Microsoft and SQL Server or AGs, because Lord knows I do that stuff every day, right? But I think most companies get to a point where it just kind of works, and the bugs, when your bugs kind of go down and you're just kind of like, well, it's relatively stable. Most people are fine with it. 80-20-90-10 rule. And those 10% who are unhappy are just going to be unhappy. Is it right? I'm not making any kind of judgment call on that. But I don't think any of the HA features are perfect. And that's what people want.
So I think the other thing for me is I understand the criticism that some of the tooling on availability groups isn't as done as we'd like to see it. I think what I find odd about people using failover clusters instead is, in my opinion, the most painful parts of slugging through an availability group, especially in a multi-subnet situation, is actually all the cluster stuff that you still have to deal with if you're doing a failover cluster.
This is generally why people hire me. Just being honest. I mean, that's it. I can think of multiple customers where we've had to deal with multi-subnet, and all the issues wound up being DNS and propagation and all this other back-end stuff where their clients can't see it fast enough, and it's literally their back-end stuff. The thing fails over pretty quickly. That's not the issue. I've seen some pretty heinous network implementations that over time get ironed out because, again, their networks were not designed with multi-subnet availability groups in mind. Their applications were not designed with multi-subnet failover equals true or anything like that. So they're blaming the platform for deficiencies on their back end. I see that quite a bit. And The problem is those are not easy fixes. That's not something where you can just go buy X and solve that. That's systemic. And that's the backbone of your company. And you can't just rip out a network and change the way you do IP subnetting. Or you can't change your switch scenario at the drop of a hat. But those are very hard discussions to have. And that's fundamental to business continuity and all this other stuff that people don't associate with SQL Server.
Exactly.
So I do have another weird question if there's still any from the broader audience.
Go for it.
It's just another one of those really weird things. So I've got a SQL Server 2019 instance we've been looking at. Periodically, for one specific table, we'll start seeing really bad execution time crop up. When we dig into it, what we find there are a bunch of missing statistics warnings for single column stats that were there before. So auto create stats is turned on, auto update stats is turned on. As far as we know, nothing is going through and actually clobbering the stats, although beyond a certain point, I wonder if I should look harder and maybe someone has something they forgot about. But yeah, it's almost like the stats, at some point the stats are updating instead of blocking until the stats update is complete. It's almost like the stats are getting wiped out. And then if you wait a few minutes, it's fine because the stats auto create and are there again. It kind of feels like a bug, so we tried doing a cumulative update, but it looks like it's still happening, even now that they're caught up.
That is kind of weird.
Yeah, we actually tried turning off auto update stats just with that one table, and the problem went away for like a week, but it just showed up again this morning, which is why it was on my mind. I think if I've stumped this audience, it probably does mean it's a bug.
Yeah. It
kind of sounds like one.
Either that or there's some like crazy runaway agent job everyone's forgotten about that's trying to clean up auto-created stats.
Yeah.
Yuck. Yeah, I got nothing on that one. Weird.
Yeah, I can't think of anything either.
Yeah. Anybody else have any questions? Arun and Chris, you guys on?
I'm going to step away for 10 seconds. I'll be right back, guys.
Cool. Yeah, no, I think I'm good. I would say at this point, I don't think we're going to get too many new questions. So I'm going to challenge each of you. I'd love to see a session from each of you for this virtual chapter over the next 6 to 9 months. The sky's the limit with what we can address with this. So for everybody that's on, what do you want to see? Literally, what topics do you want to see? What are you curious about? What have you not played with yet but are wondering? Let us know, because we want to create sessions for you all. We've got sessions galore that we can present, but if there's something that's really nagging you or intriguing you, let me know. I'd love to find a good speaker and get a good presentation going for everybody.
Well, so here's something that's been bothering me, and this seems like a recurring topic, not only with my user group, but Summit and conferences and all that I can't think of a better phrase, but like physical tuning, like hardware understanding is critical to most of what we do. Maybe less so in the cloud if you're on PaaS stuff, but most of us aren't 100% on that. Why is it that those sessions, like how do we better package sessions like that with good information?
It's funny. I had
to draw people, because like people don't show up, and the people that show up are
Right.
super into it, and they're like, "Oh man, this is awesome!" And I learned all this stuff, and I'm gonna do it. And I mean, and I can think back, like Alan, a session of yours, I think in New York in like 2015, helped me a ton. It was part of the reason I went. But people just don't show up for them.
They don't. No, well,
How do
that's
we
why I
fix it?
stopped submitting them, because nobody shows up for them. I mean, honestly, it's not that I don't want to do them. I just, nobody cares. Well, I shouldn't say that. My experience is that they care when they have a problem because
Yes.
it's that. They don't care because, again, it's not the stuff I generally present for the most part is not really sexy topics. It's not performance tuning queries. It's not stuff that like you can go home and put into practice right now and see an immediate result. A lot of my stuff is, we're talking about networking and how to plan an availability group, or, even if you're talking about troubleshooting, if you don't hit the condition or use it, you're not going to really. So, and that's, I think, just a general problem with conferences as a whole, is that people want the more immediate topics, but not the stuff that really would make the bigger difference in their day-to-day lives if they understood it better. And it's not an indictment of anybody. That's just the way it's been forever. It's
human nature.
Yeah,
And-
absolutely.
Well, it's so easy to kind of patch over, right? Like, oh, we'll just upgrade Windows, or we'll patch SQL, or we'll buy a new server, new storage array, whatever. But yeah, I've been struggling with that. Like, I feel like there's not a marketing element, but there's like an element we're missing here to make those topics
You're not wrong.
draw.
No, you're not wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, this is actually why I've started recording videos and putting them on YouTube, and I've got a bunch queued up and loading. But it's how do you make a non-glamorous topic glamorous enough to where somebody is going to not go to another glamorous topic to see your not glamorous topic. And that's a challenge. And just like Alan said, I mean, literally, these are really big problems when people have problems with these in production on a Tuesday afternoon. And now they're Googling to try to figure out anything and everything that they can find. And if the session's recorded from a conference, they're going to go watch it on the spot. But they're not going to go there live during the conference. And, to me, I feel like this is why I'm starting to put, because I mean, most of what I do, if things just work, nobody knows about, nobody cares about. That's why I'm starting to try to put more stuff out on YouTube. I'm really trying to get more in the habit of blogging again. And
yeah, I'm kind of the same way, David. Like I've hit that point where just I sort of took a little time off just because I kind of needed it. Just being honest, but yeah, I'm working on some of that stuff as well. Some free, some paid. I do make a living. But at the same time, you look at it, if you look at all the marketing that all these companies put out, VMware, Microsoft, third-party people, like all the backup stuff, it just works. Push a button, your things happen. How many times have all of us talked to a customer where they're doing, let's say, snapshot-based backups or whatever you want to call them, and it breaks SQL Server over the years. And I still see it with customers today, and they don't understand why. And of course, now they're fighting with their backup teams and their infrastructure teams. DBAs just want solid backups. And you got to bring somebody in who's not the vendor to sort the mess out. Or at least have somebody in-house that understands the different parts of the problem. To Edwin's point in comments, it's a marketing problem because all these vendors put out there that this stuff really does just work. And we all know from an implementation perspective and day-to-day perspective, that is not the case.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think the other piece of it, as far as conferences go, going back to the original topic, was that a lot of times people that go to the conferences don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
And they're looking for solutions for problems that they know they have. They're not looking for solutions that will solve a problem that isn't staring them in the face.
Edwin made a comment just like that. Try refraining the topic as a pressing problem. And that's very true.
It is. It is.
Yeah, and it might be one of those things where, as gross as it can feel, like that clickbaity title helps, because people are like, "Oh man, oh yeah, I've seen that. I need to go to that because we have that."
Yeah,
I've been studying a lot of marketing over the last year just for that reason, to be able to communicate some of these things to clients and potential clients better.
Yeah, I mean, I did that for a conference I submitted for next year. I don't normally do the clickbaity titles, but I figured, what the heck, right? Because I'm very much a tell them what you're going to tell them and tell them again kind of guy.
Yeah.
Because I just don't see the point of misleading people or, again, doing the clickbaity stuff. But I think you do have to make it, shall we say, more interesting to some people. But even then, right? Like, even if you say, like, how to avoid the worst disaster with SQL Server, it's still going to boil down to talking about networking and storage and architecting, right? Which they're not going to find that interesting, right? So you can, I've reframed the arguments, but I find that just the topic matter or the general subject matter is not stuff people, because I get a lot of people who are like, look, I do T-SQL, I do this, I do everything but want to think about the stuff underneath. It's like, that's why we're paying you. And it's like, okay, but you still need to understand it.
Yeah, it's a drum I beat in every HA session I give, that like I run in as a consultant for sure, and even now just giving talks and stuff. Like, some people are proudly siloed, and in our world now, you shouldn't be. Like, if you're like, oh, I don't know networking at all,
Well,
you're
learn the basics.
way behind where you need to be, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you, once you get somebody there, you can see the light bulb go on, like, oh yeah, I should understand how that works, and I should understand like what cluster quorum is and stuff like that, and not exclusively trust my operations group to know that. But yeah, the trick is, like, how do you break that with people that will proudly say, like, I just write queries, or I just take backups, and I don't need to understand anything else because I'm good at what I do. Like, to be a fully featured DBA these days, you've got to have basic knowledge in some other areas.
Yeah.
And you also need to, the DBAs need to remember too that their first priority is essentially data protection, meaning that the data has to be backed up, available, secured. Then all the other stuff like query tuning and performance tuning, like that's secondary. If your data is not available, the query is not going anywhere.
Edwin made a great comment here, or actually that's Alan on here. It's people have query pain. People have lots of other types of pain. You don't have HA pain until you have HA outages.
Well, right, but Edwin's point was on point when he said, you need people need to feel the pain. You need to relate to pain. But if you've never felt the pain, you can't relate to it. Yep. That's ultimately the problem, right? And that's exactly what David just said, is if you never have an outage, or it's at an off time that it didn't affect the business people during the day and it's not painful for the business, they kind of shrug sometimes and go, well, it kind of happened and no big deal. It's but like, when it happens on your busiest day at 10 in the morning, and everybody's screaming, whole different level of pain.
Yep. It's like I always tell people whenever I do my boot camps, when was the last time you practiced repairing corruption? And the answer is statistically always never. It's like, well, fixing corruption from a production system while your business is down is not the time to start experimenting with this.
No, absolutely. Well, it goes back. That brings up a point that we should probably talk about, is having like things like test systems, right? That I still see so many customers who deploy these architectures, complex or not, in production, but have no facsimile, even virtualized, that to just get the look and feel of it in a non-prod environment, and then try and do these other things, and it doesn't jive.
Hang on, sorry to interrupt. We have a great question from Arun here. What's the difference between, or what is the availability difference between an Azure SQL DB and an Azure Managed Instance? The Managed Instance uses availability groups in the background for the business critical tier. Do we face the availability group issues in Azure as well?
That is a great question.
Well, I would say the reality is depends what issues we're talking about, because all that's managed behind the scenes. Things like connectivity and like names you connect to, Microsoft is managing that for you essentially. So, but it still is, in essence, an AG. So anything that could be an issue would be an issue. You just have less control over dealing with it.
And I would claim that the Microsoft automation is able to recover from a lot of that faster because you're not sitting there staring at it 24 hours a day.
Right.
They've got the automation to detect and accommodate immediately or very, very soon.
So I'd say, the issues would be very different in Azure because of that.
And most of the AG failures that I've been around are human.
Yes.
We did a thing and it was dumb, or we did a thing and didn't understand what it would do. And I feel like the Azure stuff is muscle memory. There are obviously humans at some point doing some of it or scheduling the automation. But they're not going to do the dumb things that I've been around. Certainly I've never done, but I've seen them.
Well, and just think about some of what we've been talking about, like the networking issues, DNS, stuff like that. Now, obviously, if somebody works Azure's networking, everybody's affected. But the typical things we've talked about, like networking, all that kind of stuff, is largely just works more often than not in all the public clouds, not just Azure, right? So if you're using like RDS and their implementation of availability groups, you're only as good as what Amazon's networking is, and it's most of all that stuff is generally rock solid. So, to Matt's point, you're taking out that human factor because you didn't design that. That was designed for scale and availability in the cloud in a way that you don't do on premises.
Yeah, I mean, been there, done that is strong in any public cloud because they've seen it. It's not like, I remember 5 years ago when this happened. Let me see if I can find the script. Like, they see it all the time, and they've worked around it. But yeah, I mean, when somebody does foobar networking in one of the public clouds, it's pretty epic.
Yes. Yeah, and Edwin just made a good point. That's another title for an HADR presentation: the most common cause of outages you were not aware of. Yeah. So Arun, does that answer your question?
It's funny. While we're kind of waiting on that, I feel like that's an area where Microsoft marketing has fallen down. Like when I'll give talks about Azure and I'll mention like, oh yeah, well there's this service tier that's an availability group under the covers basically, but you don't have to manage any of it. And you see people go like, oh, huh. And even customers, like I'd walk into some place and they're like, well, we have 4 node AGs for every client. We have 20 clients, so we're going to put 80 VMs in Azure. I'm like, well, have you considered, managed instance or some service tier of Azure SQL? Well, no, we haven't because we need AGs and that's what we've got. I was like, well, it is that. And they're just marketing, I don't feel like has gotten that message through where people understand that. And that's, I feel like it's something they should focus on. Not that Microsoft needs to make more money, but I feel like they could, because some people be like, well, I don't like managing this stuff, or they feel like they've got to move the whole thing to the cloud, and AGs and Azure are not barrels of laughs. But if you knew there's a way of like you're getting what you want out of an AG without the management component, it's interesting that it kind of falls on people in the community to get that word out. I'm not sure why.
So there's a part 2 to this question. What is the availability difference just as a whole between Azure SQL DB and managed instance?
Well, I mean, so for Azure SQL DB, you kind of have the sort of the geo stuff, right? Which to a degree is just availability groups in a way, right? Like they're not calling it that, they're not saying it's that, but it acts and feels a lot like an availability group, let's just say. you know, and I think I haven't looked at them in a while, but the SLAs may be different between the two. So you got to look at things like your SLAs. And by the way, Microsoft stuff, if you go out and look in Azure, all that stuff is under their legal agreements. It's actually not under the normal stuff. It's actually in their legal agreement section for a reason, you know. But this, to me, fundamentally goes back to if Microsoft is handling kind of what Matt's talking about. If all this is handled behind the scenes by Microsoft, do you honestly really care what the technology is if it's up and running and has what you need it to? So I think maybe reframing the question from Arun is, why does that matter to you if it's up and running and gives you the failover scenarios you need, right? Now, you could look at other things, like, for example, the inability to take a backup of an Azure SQL database or a backup from Azure SQL managed instance and put it on IaaS, or that's more of a problem to me than the availability stuff, because if you have an issue, there's no easy way to get your data out of the cloud to something more traditional. Like, so if we're talking business continuity, that to me is something I'd be thinking about more so than how's Microsoft managing my availability behind the scenes. Just my take on that.
I like that. The business. I'm looking up the formal defined SLAs for these things, and I found it for Azure SQL database. Some business critical tier Azure SQL DB, they claim 99.995% uptime. I'm still looking them up for the managed instance, but I know when you buy the business critical tier, which for the scenario would be appropriate, it's going to be actually I just found it 99.99. So that's good. It's not great, but the question is, what do you need? And then, just like Alan's point, being able to handle all of these other things related to business continuity. How does that factor into which tier you're selecting? Or really, not tier, which service you're selecting?
Yeah. Well, the other comment I would have is that those numbers are just their guarantees. That's not what the actual availability is. The availability is probably much higher, but they're not willing to guarantee 5 nines or something like that, just to give themselves some room in case that there is a failure.
I mean, 4 nines is still 52.6 or 8 minutes of downtime cum, per year. That's still ridiculously low number.
Yeah.
I used to when I used to do a lot of more basic HA presentations, I would sort of pause on that side and sort of like how many, do the whole how many people here can actually achieve 5.28 minutes of downtime a year, and the reality is nobody can. Literally at that point, you're never touching your system, never patching it. You're just praying that nothing else happens to cause a problem with that on premises.
And then you run into problems with having never rebooted the thing for 2 years.
There's that. Well, again, it begs other problems, right?
Yeah.
So people need to really understand when they're talking about availability, whether you want to split that out into just calling it business continuity or separating into local availability versus disaster recovery. When you come up with these availability numbers that you want to hit, do you actually understand what that means? You didn't pull some magic number out of a hat going, yeah, we want 4 or 5 nines of availability. Okay, do you grok that? And most people don't.
They don't. A lot of people blur the distinction. I had one CEO that wanted to fail over to DR so that they could do Windows patches. It's like, I'm sorry, but it doesn't quite work like that. I wish it would, but it doesn't. And that's, I think, if any of you would like to actually present a business continuity basics session, I'd love to see that come from one of you all. I mean, literally,
do that. I love doing those talks, actually.
Tell you what, let's sign you up for August if you're game.
Sure.
Cool. Tell me, so I'm going to keep this chapter kind of flexible with scheduling. Ideally, I'd like the first week of the month just because it gets into less holidays with that, but it's literally up to your schedule. I'd like to try to stick around this time, but again, earlier, later, whatever works for you. We're going to record them and get them out on a new YouTube channel I'm going to create here later today. So shoot me a message with title, abstract, date and time that works for you. Let's get it out there.
Sure.
I think that'd be great because it's one of those things we can market to literally everybody because there's misconceptions about all of the pieces that go into a true business continuity strategy.
Well, and it's a thing that most people get wrong. I mean, yeah, I'd love to hear from everybody else on this call because everybody else here isn't a consultant. Some people are FTEs or, work with different size or types of customers than I do. But the common denominator I often see is that the business and the technical folks, there's huge disconnects of what is actually possible versus what they desire.
Yeah.
Right. Or they used to use technology X and we used to be able to do this. I'm like, yeah, but you're also not trying to do this now either. Right. You want to be able to do readable secondaries, but you want to have no impact on your primary and you want to do all this other stuff. Yeah. At what point do you kind of call like that's just not realistic?
Well, it's to me it goes back to how do you put a dollar amount on the setup costs of somebody's expectations and help them realize that what they want is so inconceivable in terms of budget, even though it might technically be possible, that how do you get them to kind of dial back their expectations so that you can put a reasonable budget to it?
Well, so I have a question to throw out to sort of the other panelists, because me not being an FTE, I don't really have this. I help customers with this. But if you're an FTE, because I've actually gotten this question, how do you try and influence the budget? Or what impact can you have? Is it out of your hands? So for those of you that are FTEs on here, I'd be curious to hear your answer.
It's a great question.
I think to some extent it varies a lot by company. I haven't been an FTE for a while, but I had 2 companies that were night and day difference in the way that you could influence the budget or not, as the case was. And a lot of it, I think, comes down to probably the one universal constant is that you have to be able to justify it in terms that the business cares about. If you can't justify it in terms that relate somehow to the company's revenue or the company's or the employee productivity or the impact on the customer, they're going to chalk it up as a wish list. But if you can relate it in terms that they understand and that they care about, then you're much more likely to get it. But it really varies a lot by the company.
Yeah, because where I see it now, actually, I agree with you, Ed. The interesting thing for me is that most technologists aren't plugged in at the business level, so they can't articulate that, which is the bigger part of the problem. But not only that, like just being able to say, hey, not understanding the business, but also saying, here's the impact and cost benefit of doing this. Like you may spend X up front. Because what I find is this is sort of the cloud versus on-premises argument too, of people looking what I call the bean counters, looking literally just at numbers, pure numbers. They're not looking at actual business impact they're looking at what does this cost me today, which is why sometimes they go, oh, we should just go to the cloud. But when we look at the actual cost of the cloud for some folks, some cases it's cheaper, in other cases it's more expensive. But they weren't looking at it over time. They were looking at the right now costs.
Right.
And it's a very interesting exercise to go through because I've been through it on the other side with some customers where they have these almost existential moments when they get their cloud bills at some point of, oh, wow, this is not as cheap as we thought. And it's like, well, this is what it is. CapEx versus OpEx.
Yeah, and there are some companies where CapEx is incredibly hard to get through, and so OpEx, if they can shove anything possible into OpEx, it doesn't matter how much OpEx it is a month.
Right.
They want to avoid capitalizing it at all costs.
Oh, absolutely. And I get it, but at some point the cost hampers the performance and availability and everything else that goes along with things, because somebody's literally saying you cannot spend more than X. This is our ceiling. It's like, okay, we can design to that, but understand it may not meet your needs.
Yep.
And that's a hard discussion to have with people, is because that's the rubber meets the road talk that nobody, again, it's not the sexy stuff. It's not the, oh, look, this wonderful solution we put in, it's great. It's all that behind the scenes planning stuff that you have very hard discussions around. And that's what business continuity is. There are lots of hard meetings and discussions of what does this need to look like? It's not technology. It's really technology supports the need. It's not the other way around.
And how do you define the need? This is not glamorous. This is why, it's honestly, long story short, many years ago, I worked at a performing arts center. The act of one of these Broadway shows going on sale was crushing major performing arts centers around the world, where literally you'll have 2,000 people lined up outside, 10,000 people on the internet, and it was taking out their systems for hours. We worked for 6 months to make sure that our system didn't go down when the biggest Broadway show to hit the Midwest came. The morning of, we were all nervous. We wanted to make sure everything worked well. We had done everything that we could. It was such a non-event that I walked around for 7 hours with my camera. And that's what HA and DR truly is. Given minor or major faults in any kind of system, does it stay running or does it recover as fast as what your requirements dictate? And I think just to go back to that session for you, Alan, to just simply outline, what do these hard conversations have to encompass? What do we need for HA, DR? How does that play into a bigger business continuity strategy? What does the business have to do to support the technology? What does the business have to decide and declare and define? That's what's a big one.
Yeah, and it's just kind of interesting that people don't take the time to do that, because they rush through, they implement these solutions, and then they get just totally hosed. They put these solutions in that on paper seem to work, but really don't.
Yeah. We do have a question here from Chris.
Awesome.
We have so essentially he's upgrading SQL Server on both nodes of an availability group because he doesn't have time constraints, or does have time constraints. Is it a good practice to upgrade only one node and test, and then upgrade the other replica later? And I would say standard DBA answer, it depends, because if you upgrade one and don't upgrade the other, if you need to fail over, you can't fail back. What other things would you guys think of?
Well, that applies if you're doing a major version upgrade. But if you're just he doesn't specify whether he's talking about a major version upgrade or just a cumulative update or something.
I was assuming major upgrade.
But even on a cumulative update, I tend to be very cautious about putting myself in a situation where I can't roll back.
Yeah, exactly.
It's possible, but
CU, he specified.
Okay. It's possible to roll back in that circumstance, but there could be unforeseen circumstances, that some little change that they made that might cause you problems if you had to roll back.
Well, I guess for me, I've seen this. I can see this both ways. To me, it depends on how long that delta is going to be. If we're talking a couple days and you've generally not had any problems where you've had to fail over stuff, it might be okay. But if we're talking like a month apart or something like that, I'd be a little more iffy, right? So I think that there's sort of a bigger discussion to have here of, what are we talking about here?
True.
Right. I generally like to do it the same weekend, same time frame, so you can test failover, test failback, and make sure everything works so that everything's good. But if you can't do that, you make that delta as short as possible, because the longer that delta is, the bigger the risk there is in my mind.
Yeah.
Edwin just made a really good analogy. The way I look at updating SQL Server on a highly available system is like driving a car on a freeway for hours with a spare tire on one of your wheels. I like that.
That is.
Yeah.
Just my viewpoint on it is like, what do you mean by testing as well? SQL and Windows are now both designed for rolling upgrades like you're talking about on cluster. So doing it is not necessarily a problem. As far as detailed testing, I would do that on a test system first and try to get rid of any problems or just check for any big issues with the update itself before you try to put it into production.
Actually, Chris,
I would do basic testing once you're do basic testing once you actually upgrade one node, but don't use that for your major testing. So you're talking about hours or minutes instead of days or weeks.
Yeah, Chris, I would add, do you have a checklist of everything that matters to you in terms of functionality that you would test and check after you install Cumulative Update? And if you do, run through the checklist when you do one and you're running from it before you do the secondary.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's easier said than done, because a lot of the stuff, it's purely functional based. You know, do we have any KPIs? Do you have a baseline of how the system is performing ahead of a patch like that? A lot of times the answer is no. Do you have the system state documented? Do you have expected outcomes of certain functions in your app? You know, anything and everything that can help you literally check off that this system is performing as expected.
Well, I think it also gets harder, and I know that this wasn't really the question, the more replicas you have, right? If you have a simple 2-node AG, this conversation is a whole lot easier. If you've got 3, 4, 5, 6 nodes in your AG, all of a sudden, you know, that's kind of a problem.
I got 40 in a distributed AG. That's fun.
I'd like to see that happen, because that's not possible. But yeah,
it's a bunch.
But I've honestly seen, like, just I don't know, like, people who do these architectures, again, they think they're great. I'm going to put an end node AG in there, and then all of a sudden it just doesn't work. And you're like, what the heck? But
yeah. Bottom line, can you test? Can you test and sign off that a machine is working the way you expect?
Yep. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I wish people would do that more, but they don't think of that. And it just winds up biting them in the rear end later.
What other questions do we have? I think we're good for today. Chris, if that answered your question, great. If not, if you have any other things, let's go ahead and add it. And then what I would love to see, and I know this is going to go into the recording, if there's anybody out there watching this after the fact that would like to see a session, let us know. We're here for you. We want to create sessions based on feedback from folks. We want to know, what are you playing with? What's a big challenge? What are you struggling with that goes into any kind of data platform, business continuity, architecture, strategy, solutions? And it doesn't, again, have to be the technical side. It could be questions like, how do I help educate the C-level on what HA and DR truly are? How can I answer all of these questions? How can I help define a budget with it? Let us know your topics. We will find you good presenters. If you want to present for the group, outstanding. Let us know. Get me an abstract. We'll get you on the calendar. And let's just have some fun. Again, this is not a glamorous topic, but quite frankly, This should be the first thing that you as a data professional should worry about. Performance, query tuning, all that stuff is secondary. The data's got to be there and be up in order for you to be able to tune it. So let us help you with a lot of these challenges. And we do have one more question here. It is covered up here. Can you all see that and tackle that question? So the question is, we've got an error log message, error 9005 on DNS replace record set W for A records.
Well, without troubleshooting, I'm looking at that going, that's permissions.
That's my thought too.
Permissions with a cluster account or something in DNS, or your DNS is not updatable. And, so I would literally be talking to your DNS and network folks and start looking what does it and seeing permissions. That's what that says to me.
Yep, exactly. That's my thought as well. One thing that I know the Microsoft guidance suggests or requires actually is that the cluster account should have the rights to be able to make all of its own changes. But I have run into,
it doesn't always have to do that, but the problem winds up being is if you don't have some of that,
right,
it's an issue.
Yeah, it causes problems. If you don't have that, it causes problems. Is what it comes down to. And I have run into, I'm sure all of us have run into environments that are completely locked down, that they are very hesitant to give that type of permission. But really what it comes down to is that that's the way it's designed to work. And if you don't allow the machine to make its own changes for this type of for this type of a scenario, when you're talking about a cluster, you're going to run into issues just because it's designed to work with being able to change its own records.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, I think with that, we'll wrap up this session. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees. Thank you, anybody who's watching this after the fact. And just like I said, we're trying to make this more of a monthly thing. This is just kind of the kickoff today. I do want to do an open Q&A like this a couple times a year, if not more frequently. So send us your questions, send us your suggestions for topics. If you want to present, fantastic. Let's get you in there. So thank you all for coming, and I look forward to this being the first of many.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.
See ya.